The silence had been a shroud wrapped so tightly around Jacob Isaiah that the other ranch hands stopped trying to reach him after the first 6 months. And by the time 2 full years had passed without a single word from his lips, most people in Carson City, Nevada treated him like a ghost who happened to be useful with horses. It was late summer in 1878 when everything changed, when a woman with dust on her boots and determination in her green eyes sat down beside him on the fence rail outside the stable and refused to let his silence push her away. Jacob had been 24 when he stopped speaking, 26 now, and the reasons lived in a place so deep inside him that sometimes he forgot they existed until night came and the memories clawed their way back to the surface. He worked the Patterson Ranch on the outskirts of town, breaking horses and mending fences, doing the kind of labor that required strong hands and no voice at all. The other men had learned to read his gestures, the slight nod that meant yes, the shake of his head for no, the way he could communicate an entire day's worth of instructions through pointed fingers and careful movements. The ranch owner, Thomas Patterson, had known Jacob since he was a boy, had watched him grow from a talkative child into a skilled horseman, and then witnessed the night that stole his voice away. Thomas never pressed him to speak, never treated him differently, and that kindness was the only thing that kept Jacob from drifting away entirely into the wilderness where men went to disappear. Jessica Davis arrived in Carson City on a Tuesday afternoon in August, stepping down from the stagecoach with a single worn leather bag and eyes that swept across the town with the careful assessment of someone who had learned not to trust first impressions. She was 23 years old, and she had traveled from Kansas City with nothing but a letter from a distant aunt, who had promised her work at the boarding house on Main Street. The aunt had died 3 weeks before Jessica arrived, and the boarding house had been sold to pay debts, leaving her stranded in a town where she knew no one and had nowhere to go. She spent her first 3 days asking around for work, moving from business to business with her shoulders squared and her chin up, despite the growing desperation that gnawed at her stomach. The saloon owner looked her up and down with eyes that made her skin crawl and offered her a position that had nothing to do with serving drinks. She walked out before he finished his sentence. The general store had no openings. The hotel was family-run, and the restaurant owner told her he couldn't afford another waitress even though she could see the exhaustion in his wife's face as she carried trays between crowded tables. It was the blacksmith, a kind older man named Henry who had a daughter back east, who told her about the Patterson Ranch. "They are always needing help with cooking and mending," he said, wiping soot from his hands. "Thomas Patterson is a fair man, pays decent wages. It is worth the ride out there to ask." Jessica rented a horse she could barely afford and rode the 5 miles out to the ranch, following Henry's directions past the rolling hills that stretched toward distant mountains. The landscape was beautiful in a harsh way, all sage brush and scattered pine trees, with the sun beating down fierce enough to make her grateful for the wide-brimmed hat she had purchased with some of her dwindling funds. The ranch was larger than she expected, with a sprawling main house, several barns, and a network of corrals where horses moved like flowing water. She tied her rented mount to the hitching post outside the main house and was walking toward the front door when she saw him. Jacob was in one of the corrals, working with a young stallion that clearly had not yet accepted the saddle. He moved with a fluid grace that seemed almost like dancing, his body swaying and shifting in response to the horse's movements, his hands gentle but firm on the lead rope. There was something mesmerizing about watching him work, the way he seemed to communicate with the animal through nothing but presence and patience. She stood there watching longer than she intended, And when the horse finally settled and allowed Jacob to approach and stroke its neck, she felt an odd sense of relief, as if she had been holding her breath along with him. Thomas Patterson was a barrel-chested man in his 50s with gray threading through his dark hair and a handshake that was firm without being aggressive. He listened to Jessica's situation without interrupting, his weathered face thoughtful, and when she finished, he nodded slowly. "My wife Margaret passed 2 years ago," he said, and there was still pain in those words. "Since then, we have been making do with what cooking and cleaning the hands can manage, which is not much, I will tell you honestly. If you can cook for 20 men and keep the main house in order, the position is yours. Room and board included, plus $30 a month." It was more than fair, more than she had hoped for, and Jessica accepted before he could change his mind. Thomas showed her to a small but clean room on the second floor of the main house, with a window that looked out over the corrals and mountains beyond. "Dinner is at 6, he said. "The men will be expecting something edible, but they are not picky. You will find the kitchen well stocked, and if you need anything from town, we make a supply run every Saturday." That first dinner was chaos as Jessica tried to familiarize herself with the kitchen, while preparing food for 20 hungry men who filed in with the kind of appetites that came from hard physical labor. She made beef stew with biscuits, simple food that was hard to ruin. And when the men sat down at the long tables in the dining hall, she watched nervously for their reactions. They ate like men who had been starving, scraping their bowls clean and reaching for seconds. And the general consensus seemed to be that she was already a significant improvement over the rotating cooking duties they had been suffering through. She learned their names gradually that first evening, attaching faces to the voices that called out thanks and compliments. There was Samuel, the foreman, a serious man in his 40s who ran the ranch operations with military precision. There was young Danny, barely 18, who had a quick smile and a tendency to talk with his mouth full until Samuel kicked him under the table. There were the twins, Marcus and Martin, who looked so similar that Jessica knew it would take her weeks to tell them apart consistently. And then there was Jacob, who sat at the far end of one table, eating slowly and watching everything with dark eyes that seemed to take in every detail. He was tall, she could tell even with him sitting, with broad shoulders and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His face was handsome in a rough-hewn way, all strong jaw and straight nose, with a mouth that stayed pressed in a neutral line that revealed nothing. She noticed that none of the other men spoke directly to him, but they included him in their conversations in a sideways manner, asking questions, and then watching for his nods or shakes of his head. It was strange, this one-sided communication, and she found herself curious about the silent man who seemed both part of the group and separate from it. After dinner, while she was washing dishes in the kitchen, Samuel came in to thank her for the meal. "The men are pleased," he said. "It has been a long time since we had proper cooking around here." "I noticed one of your men does not speak," Jessica said, trying to sound casual. "The tall one at the end of the table." "Jacob," Samuel said, and something in his expression shuddered. "He has his reasons. He has not spoken a word in 2 years, but he is the best hand with horses I have ever seen. He understands them in a way most people never will." "What happened?" Jessica asked, then immediately felt guilty for prying. "I am sorry, that is not my business." Samuel was quiet for a moment, and she thought he would not answer. Then he sighed. "His younger brother was killed 2 years ago, murdered by a man named William Crow over a card game in town. Jacob tracked Crow into the mountains, and when he came back 3 weeks later, he was alone and he never spoke again. Some say he killed Crow and the guilt took his voice. Others say he found Crow already dead, and something about that broke something inside him. Jacob never told anyone, and without words, the truth died with whatever happened out there. Jessica felt a chill run through her despite the warmth of the kitchen. That is terrible. His brother Thomas, named after the boss, was only 19, good kid full of life. Jacob practically raised him after their parents died when Jacob was 16. Losing him the way he did, it destroyed something in Jacob. We are just grateful he came back at all and did not disappear into the wilderness forever. That night, lying in her new bed and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling around her, Jessica thought about the silent man in the corral and the weight of grief heavy enough to steal someone's voice. She understood loss, had felt it when her own parents died of fever within days of each other, leaving her alone in Kansas City with an aunt she barely knew. But she had kept talking, kept moving forward, because silence felt like giving up. She wondered what it would take to make someone choose wordlessness, to lock themselves away from the world so completely. The days fell into a rhythm quickly. Jessica rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, learning the preferences and quirks of the men she cooked for. She discovered that Marcus had a sweet tooth and would eat anything with sugar in it, that Danny could not stand onions, that Samuel drank his coffee black and strong enough to dissolve a horseshoe. She kept the house clean, mended clothes when needed, and started planting a vegetable garden in a patch of earth behind the kitchen that had been neglected since Margaret Patterson's death. And she watched Jacob, though she tried not to be obvious about it. He was always the first one out in the morning and the last one to come in at night, working with a focus that seemed almost desperate. She saw him gentle wild horses, repair broken fences, and help the younger hands learn their way around livestock. She saw the way animals trusted him, how even the most skittish horse would calm under his hands. There was something beautiful about his competence, the way his body moved with purpose and grace. But she also saw his isolation, the way he ate alone even when surrounded by people, the way he walked back to the bunkhouse by himself while the other men stayed up talking and playing cards. He lived in a bubble of silence that no one seemed willing or able to penetrate, and after 2 weeks of watching, Jessica decided she was going to try. It started small. She began saving the best biscuit from breakfast for him, placing it wrapped in a cloth napkin beside his plate at dinner. The first time she did it, he looked up at her with surprise in his dark eyes, and she smiled and walked away before he could react. The next day, she did it again, and the day after that. It became a pattern, her small gesture of acknowledgement, and though he never smiled or nodded his thanks, she noticed that he always ate the biscuit and folded the napkin carefully before he left. 3 weeks after her arrival, she saw him working late in the corral closest to the house, wrestling with a section of fence that had come loose. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and most of the other hands had already gone in for the evening. Jessica finished putting away the last of the dinner dishes, poured 2 cups of coffee, and walked out to the corral. Jacob did not look up when she approached, too focused on hammering a stubborn post into the ground. Jessica set one of the coffee cups on the fence rail beside him, and then, in a moment of boldness that surprised even herself, she climbed up and sat on the rail a few feet away. He paused in his work, hammer frozen mid-swing, and turned to look at her. His expression was wary, like a wild animal deciding whether to bolt, and she could see the question in his eyes. "What are you doing?" "It is a nice evening," Jessica said conversationally, as if sitting on fences with silent cowboys was something she did every day. "I thought you might like some coffee. I made it the way Samuel takes his, strong enough to wake the dead." Jacob stared at her for a long moment, then slowly set down his hammer and reached for the coffee. He took a sip, his eyes never leaving hers, and she saw something shift in his expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening around his eyes that might have been the beginning of one. They sat there in comfortable silence, drinking coffee and watching the sun finish its descent behind the mountains. Jessica did not try to force conversation, did not ask him questions that would require answers he could not or would not give. She just sat beside him, present and patient, and when she finally climbed down from the fence and took both empty cups back to the house, she felt his eyes following her all the way. After that, it became their routine. Most evenings, after dinner was cleaned up and the ranch was settling into night, Jessica would take 2 cups of coffee out to wherever Jacob was working. Sometimes he was in the corral, sometimes in the barn checking on the horses, sometimes just sitting on a fence rail staring out at the darkening landscape. She would sit beside him without asking permission, and they would share the silence together. The other ranch hands noticed, of course. Samuel mentioned it to her one evening while she was preparing breakfast. "You spend a lot of time with Jacob," he said, not quite making it a question. "He seems lonely," Jessica replied, cracking eggs into a bowl. "Everyone needs a friend." "Jacob does not have friends," Samuel said gently. "He has co-workers and people who leave him alone. That has been enough for him for 2 years. "Maybe it has not been enough," Jessica said. "Maybe he has just been waiting for someone to be stubborn enough not to give up." Samuel laughed at that, a short, surprised sound. "You might be right. Just be careful. Whatever is inside him that keeps him quiet, it is not something light. I would not want to see you hurt if it turns out he cannot be reached." But Jessica had already decided that Jacob Isaiah was worth reaching, even if it took time. There was something in his eyes during their evening coffee sessions, a hunger that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with connection. He was not as isolated as he pretended, not as content in his silence as everyone assumed. She saw the way he leaned slightly toward her when she spoke, the way his attention focused completely on her words even when she was talking about nothing important. He was listening in a way that most people never did, absorbing every word like a man dying of thirst who had finally found water. A month after Jessica arrived at the ranch, a problem emerged with some of the horses. 3 of them fell sick within days of each other, and despite Jacob's best efforts and the veterinarian Thomas brought in from Carson City, 2 of the animals died. The third, a gray mare that Jessica had developed a fondness for, hung on but barely. She found Jacob in the mare's stall late one night, sitting in the straw with the animal's head resting in his lap. His face was carved from stone, but she could see the pain in every line of his body, the way his hands stroked the mare's neck with a desperate gentleness. Jessica did not hesitate. She walked into the stall, closed the gate behind her, and sat down beside him in the straw. She did not say anything, just rested her hand on his shoulder and stayed there, keeping vigil with him through the long hours of the night. The mare died just before dawn, taking her last breath with her head still pillowed on Jacob's lap. Jessica felt him stiffen, felt the tremor that ran through his entire body, and then she felt the wetness of tears falling onto her hand where it rested on his arm. He was crying silently, his face turned away from her, his shoulders shaking with the force of emotions he had kept locked away for 2 years. Jessica wrapped her arms around him without asking permission, pulling him close, and he collapsed against her like a building finally giving way to age and gravity. He did not make a sound, but his hands clutched at her shirt with desperate strength, and she held him through it all, murmuring wordless comfort into his dark hair. When the storm finally passed and Jacob pulled away, his face was red and his eyes were swollen, but something had shifted. He looked at her with an intensity that stole her breath, and she saw gratitude there, and pain, and something else that made her heart beat faster. She helped him bury the mare in the field behind the barn where they laid all the ranch animals to rest. They worked together in the early morning light, digging the hole and lowering the animal gently into the earth. When it was done, Jacob stood there for a long moment with his head bowed, and Jessica stood beside him with her hand in his, letting him grieve. After that night, something changed between them. Jacob started seeking her out during the day, appearing in the kitchen while she was cooking to help her carry heavy pots or chop vegetables. He started sitting closer during their evening coffee sessions, close enough that their shoulders touched, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. He did not speak, but he communicated in other ways, through gestures and looks and the gentle touches that became more frequent as the weeks passed. Jessica found herself falling for the silent cowboy, despite all logic and reason. She lay awake at night thinking about the way his hands moved when he worked, strong and capable and surprisingly gentle. She caught herself watching for him during the day, her heart lifting when she spotted his tall frame crossing the yard. She started taking more care with her appearance, pinning her hair in more flattering styles, and wearing the nicer of her two dresses when she could manage it. Thomas Patterson noticed, of course. He was not blind, and he had known Jacob too long not to see the changes in the younger man. One evening in September, he asked Jessica to stay after dinner for a conversation in his office. "I have been watching you with Jacob," Thomas said without preamble, settling into the chair behind his desk. "I have seen something in him these past 2 months that I have not seen since his brother died. You have reached him in ways none of us could." Jessica felt her cheeks warm. "He is easy to care about once you look past the silence." "I agree," Thomas said. "Jacob has been like a son to me since his parents died. His father worked this ranch for 20 years before a horse kicked him in the chest and killed him. His mother followed 6 months later from grief and pneumonia. I promised them both I would look after their boys, and I failed when Thomas Jr. died. I could not protect Jacob from that pain, and I could not bring him back from wherever he went inside himself afterward. He is still here," Jessica said quietly. "He just needed someone to sit with him in the dark until he was ready to come back to the light." Thomas smiled, and there was approval in his expression. "You have feelings for him." It was not a question, but Jessica answered anyway. "Yes." "Does he know?" "I think so," Jessica said. "But he has not said anything, obviously, and I do not want to push him. He needs to move at his own pace." "Jacob has always been the kind of man who feels things deeply," Thomas said. "When he loves completely. It is part of what destroyed him when Thomas Jr. died. They were closer than most brothers, had to be after losing their parents so young. I think Jacob felt responsible for his brother's death somehow, even though it was not his fault. William Crow was a mean drunk who would have killed someone eventually. It just happened to be Thomas Jr. who drew the short straw that night." Jessica leaned forward. "Samuel said no one knows what happened when Jacob went after Crow." Thomas was quiet for a moment, his expression troubled. "The sheriff found Crow's body 3 months after Jacob came back. He had been shot once in the chest, killed quick and clean. His camp was undisturbed, his horse was still there, and there was no sign of struggle. It looked like someone walked up to him and executed him, then left him for the buzzards. The sheriff ruled it self-defense given the circumstances, and no charges were filed. But Jacob never confirmed or denied that he was the one who pulled the trigger, and without his voice to tell the story, we may never know the truth." "Maybe the truth does not matter," Jessica said. "Maybe what matters is that he survived it and he is still here, still capable of caring about things and people. I see it in the way he works with the horses, in the way he has been with me. Whatever happened out there, it did not kill the good parts of him." "No," Thomas agreed. "It did not. And I am glad he has you to help him remember that." As autumn settled over the Nevada landscape, painting the hills in shades of gold and amber, Jessica and Jacob's relationship deepened in ways that had nothing to do with words. He started leaving small gifts for her: wildflowers on her windowsill, a perfectly round stone he had found by the creek, a carved wooden bird that must have taken him hours to make. She treasured each one, keeping them on the shelf beside her bed where she could see them when she woke. They took walks together in the evenings, following the paths that wound through the ranch property and into the foothills beyond. Jacob showed her his favorite places: a meadow where deer came to graze at dusk, a rocky outcrop that offered a view of the entire valley, a stand of aspen trees that would turn gold in another few weeks. He communicated through gestures and expressions, and Jessica found she could read him more easily now, could interpret the tilt of his head or the set of his shoulders as clearly as spoken words. One evening in early October, they were sitting on their usual fence rail watching the sunset when a group of wild horses appeared in the distance, moving across the open grassland like flowing silk. Jacob went very still beside her, his eyes tracking the animals with an intensity that spoke of deep longing. "They are beautiful," Jessica said softly. "So free." Jacob nodded, and when he looked at her, there was something raw and vulnerable in his expression. He raised one hand and touched her cheek gently, his calloused fingers rough against her skin, and Jessica felt her breath catch. "Jacob," she whispered, and his name on her lips seemed to undo something in him. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away, but she did not move. His lips touched hers softly, carefully, as if she were something precious that might break. Jessica kissed him back, her hand coming up to rest against his chest where she could feel his heart pounding like a wild thing trying to escape. When they finally pulled apart, Jacob rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, his breathing uneven. Jessica wrapped her arms around his neck and held him close, feeling the way his hands gripped her waist, like he was afraid she might disappear if he let go. They did not speak, because words were not necessary. Everything they needed to say was there in the kiss, in the embrace, in the way they held each other as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. After that night, they were together in the way that mattered, though they kept their relationship quiet out of respect for the ranch's dynamics and Jessica's position in the household. But the other hands noticed anyway, saw the way Jacob and Jessica moved in each other's orbits, the way they gravitated toward each other whenever they were in the same space. There was some good-natured teasing directed at Jessica, but it was friendly rather than malicious, and she bore it with good humor and a blush that she could not quite hide. Thomas Patterson gave his blessing without being asked, pulling Jessica aside one morning to tell her that he was happy for both of them and that Margaret would have liked her very much. "She always worried about Jacob," he said. "She wanted him to find someone who could see past his rough edges to the good man underneath. I think she would be pleased that he found you." Winter came to Carson City with cold winds and occasional snow that turned the landscape into something otherworldly and beautiful. The ranch work continued, harder now with the weather, and Jessica spent her days keeping the main house warm and cooking hearty meals to sustain the men through the demanding physical labor. Jacob started spending more time in the main house, ostensibly to help with chores but really just to be near Jessica. He would sit at the kitchen table while she cooked, whittling small figures from pieces of wood, or he would help her hang laundry in the covered area behind the house where it could dry protected from the snow. They developed a comfortable domesticity that felt natural and right, as if they had been together for years rather than months. On Christmas Eve, Thomas hosted a small celebration for the ranch hands, with a special dinner and gifts for everyone. Jessica cooked a feast of roasted chicken and ham, with potatoes and vegetables and 3 different kinds of pie. The men ate until they could barely move, and afterward they sang songs and told stories by the fire in the main room of the house. Jacob sat beside Jessica on the sofa, his hand holding hers hidden between them, and she felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. This was what she had been searching for without knowing it, a place to belong and people who cared about her, and a man whose silence spoke volumes about the depth of his feelings. Thomas gave out small gifts he had purchased on his last trip to town, practical things like new gloves and socks, but the real gift was the sense of family that filled the room. These men, who came from different backgrounds and had their own stories of loss and hardship, had formed something solid and good in this isolated place, and Jessica felt privileged to be part of it. After the others had gone to bed, Jessica and Jacob sat by the dying fire, watching the flames flicker and dance. Jacob had been more tactile than usual all evening, keeping his hand on her back or shoulder, and she could sense something building in him, some decision being weighed and measured. Finally, he stood up and held out his hand to her. She took it, curious, and he led her to the front door. They bundled up in coats and scarves and stepped out into the cold December night. The sky was clear and full of stars, and fresh snow crunched under their boots as they walked toward the barn. Inside, it was warmer, the body heat of the horses and the insulation of the hay keeping the worst of the cold at bay. Jacob led her to an empty stall that he had clearly prepared earlier, with thick blankets laid over fresh straw and a lantern hanging from a hook that cast a warm, golden light over everything. He turned to face her, and even in the dim light, she could see the intensity in his eyes. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small wooden box, and when he opened it, Jessica saw a ring inside. It was simple silver, clearly old, with a small blue stone set in the center. "Jacob," she breathed, understanding immediately. He went down on one knee in the straw, still holding the box, and looked up at her with a question in his eyes that needed no words. "Will you marry me?" Jessica felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. "Yes," she finally managed. "Yes, of course, yes." Jacob stood up so fast he almost knocked her over, and then he was kissing her with a desperation and joy that made her dizzy. She kissed him back with everything she had, and when they finally broke apart they were both laughing breathlessly, their foreheads pressed together, their hands tangled in each other's clothes. Jacob slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly. Jessica looked down at it, then up at him. "It is beautiful. Where did you get it?" He pulled a small notebook from his pocket, the kind he sometimes used to communicate more complex ideas, and wrote quickly. "It was my mother's. She wanted me to give it to the woman I loved." Jessica felt more tears fall, but these were happy tears, tears of joy at being chosen and loved by this complicated, damaged, beautiful man. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you so much." Jacob pulled her close and held her, and she felt the vibration of his chest as if he were trying to speak, but the words would not come. She understood. The feelings were too big for words anyway, too important to be contained in language. So they stood there in the barn, wrapped in each other's arms, while the horses shifted in their stalls and the lantern light flickered and danced. They were married in late January in a simple ceremony at the small church in Carson City. Jessica wore a dress that Thomas had insisted on buying for her, a beautiful deep blue that brought out her eyes, and Jacob wore his best clothes, his dark hair neatly combed and his face freshly shaved. All the ranch hands attended, along with a few of the townspeople who knew and respected Jacob, and the ceremony was short and sweet. When the preacher asked Jacob if he took Jessica to be his lawfully wedded wife, there was a moment of silence where everyone held their breath, waiting. Jacob looked at Jessica with his whole heart in his eyes and nodded firmly, and the preacher, who had been warned about the situation, smiled and said, "I will take that as a yes." Jessica said her vows clearly and firmly, meaning every word, and when the preacher pronounced them married, Jacob kissed her in front of everyone with a possessiveness and joy that made several of the ranch hands whistle and cheer. The reception was held at the ranch, with food and music and dancing that lasted until late into the night. Jessica danced with Thomas and Samuel and Danny and half a dozen other ranch hands, but mostly she danced with Jacob, who held her close and moved with the same grace he showed when working with horses. Late in the evening, when most of the guests had left and the remaining ranch hands were passed out or nearly there, Jacob led Jessica upstairs to the room that Thomas had given them, a larger space on the second floor that had been Margaret Patterson's sewing room. It had been cleaned and furnished with a proper bed and wardrobe, and there were flowers on the windowsill and candles burning that cast a warm, romantic light over everything. Jacob closed the door behind them and then just stood there looking at Jessica with an expression of wonder, as if he could not quite believe she was real and his. She walked to him slowly and took his hands in hers, then reached up to cup his face. "I love you," she said clearly. "I am so grateful I got on that stagecoach and came to Carson City. I am so grateful I sat beside you on that fence rail. I am so grateful for every moment we have had and every moment we will have." Jacob's eyes were bright with unshed tears, and he pulled her into a kiss that started gentle but quickly deepened into something more urgent. They undressed each other slowly, learning the geography of each other's bodies, and when they finally came together, it was with a tenderness and passion that left them both breathless and changed. Afterward, lying tangled in the sheets with Jacob's arms around her and his heart beating steadily against her back, Jessica felt a peace she had never known before. She had found her home, not in a place but in a person, and she knew with absolute certainty that she would spend the rest of her life grateful for that truth. The winter passed into spring, and Jessica settled into her new life as Jacob's wife. She continued her work at the ranch, though Thomas insisted on giving her less demanding duties and hiring another woman from town to help with the cooking and cleaning. Jessica spent more time with the horses, learning from Jacob how to gentle them and train them, and she discovered she had a natural talent for the work. Jacob remained silent, but it bothered Jessica less and less as time went on. She had learned to read him so well that she rarely needed words to understand what he was thinking or feeling. He communicated through touch and expression, and the small kindnesses he showed her every day. He brought her coffee in bed on cold mornings, left her love notes written in his careful handwriting, and held her close at night as if she were the most precious thing in his world. In late April, Jessica realized she had missed her monthly courses twice in a row, and a visit to the doctor in Carson City confirmed what she had suspected. She was pregnant, due to deliver in early December. She told Jacob that evening, leading him out to their favorite fence rail and taking his hands in hers. "I have news," she said, watching his face carefully. "We are going to have a baby." For a moment, Jacob just stared at her, processing the information. Then his face broke into the biggest smile she had ever seen, a smile that transformed him from handsome to absolutely beautiful. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing silently, and when he set her down, He kissed her with such joy and love that she felt tears spring to her eyes. That night, lying in bed with Jacob's hand resting protectively on her still flat stomach, Jessica felt a completeness she had never imagined possible. She had lost so much in her life, but she had found even more here in this harsh, beautiful landscape with this silent, strong man who loved her beyond measure. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and into summer. Jessica's belly grew round, and the baby moved and kicked with increasing vigor as the months passed. Jacob was attentive to the point of being overprotective, constantly trying to take over her chores and worrying whenever she moved too quickly or lifted anything heavier than a teacup. The ranch hands treated her like she was made of glass, rushing to help her with any task and hovering whenever she walked across uneven ground. It was endearing and slightly annoying in equal measure, and Jessica finally had to put her foot down and insist that she was pregnant, not dying, and perfectly capable of living her normal life. Thomas was thrilled at the prospect of a baby on the ranch, and he started building a cradle in his woodshop with the kind of detailed care that spoke of how much he wished he and Margaret had been able to have children of their own. He presented it to Jacob and Jessica in early November, a beautiful piece of furniture carved with horses and mountains and stars. Jessica went into labor on a cold December morning, 3 weeks before the doctor had predicted. Jacob was in the barn when it started, and by the time Samuel found him and brought him running to the house, Jessica was already well into the process with the doctor and Thomas's sister Rachel, who had come to help with the birth, attending to her. Jacob stood outside the bedroom door, clearly desperate to be inside but respecting the doctor's orders that he stay out. Jessica could hear him pacing, could imagine his face tight with worry, and between contractions, she called out to him that she was fine, that everything was going to be all right. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the afternoon and into the evening. Jessica had never known pain like this, waves of agony that seemed endless, but she focused on the promise at the end, the baby she would finally get to hold. Finally, just after midnight, with one last exhausting push, the baby was born. The cry that filled the room was the most beautiful sound Jessica had ever heard, and when the doctor placed the small, warm weight on her chest, she looked down into the face of her son and felt her heart expand with a love so fierce, it was almost frightening. "It is a boy," the doctor announced, and Rachel opened the door to tell Jacob, who was still pacing in the hallway. He burst into the room, his hair disheveled and his face pale, and crossed to the bed in 3 long strides. When he saw Jessica holding their son, his expression transformed into something beyond words, a combination of joy and wonder and love so intense that it seemed to radiate from him like light. Jessica smiled up at him tiredly. "Come meet your son." Jacob sat carefully on the edge of the bed and reached out with trembling hands to touch the baby's tiny fist. The infant wrapped his fingers around Jacob's thumb with surprising strength, and Jacob made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "He is perfect," Jessica whispered. "He has your eyes." They named him Thomas Jacob Isaiah, after the brother Jacob had lost, and the man who had been like a father to him, and young Thomas was welcomed into the world with more love and joy than any baby could possibly need. The first few months of Thomas's life were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Jessica had never been so tired or so happy, navigating the endless cycle of feeding and changing, and soothing while her body recovered from childbirth. Jacob was surprisingly good with the baby, holding him for hours while Jessica rested, walking the floor at night when Thomas fussed, changing diapers with the same patient competence he brought to training horses. The ranch hands were utterly useless around the baby, reduced to making faces and cooing noises whenever Jessica brought Thomas into the dining hall. Even Samuel, the serious foreman, turned into a puddle of sentimentality whenever he held the infant. Danny appointed himself Thomas's protector, and could often be found standing guard outside the house as if bandits might arrive at any moment to steal the baby. Spring came again, bringing new life to the ranch in the form of foals and calves and the greening of the winter-brown landscape. Thomas grew from a tiny wrinkled newborn into a chubby happy baby who smiled at everything and everyone. He had Jacob's dark hair and eyes, but Jessica's smile and the stubborn set of his chin that belonged to both of them. On a warm evening in May, with Thomas sleeping peacefully in his cradle and the windows open to let in the sweet spring air, Jessica and Jacob sat together in their room, simply enjoying the quiet moment. Jacob had been writing something in his notebook, and when he finished, he passed it to Jessica. She read the words he had written, simple and direct. "I am the luckiest man alive. Thank you for giving me a reason to live again." Jessica felt tears prick her eyes as she looked up at him. "You are the one who saved me," she said. "I had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. You gave me a home and a family, and a love I never thought I would find." Jacob reached out and cupped her face in his hand, his thumb stroking her cheek, and the love in his eyes was answer enough to anything she might have said. They sat there in the peaceful evening, listening to their son breathe, and Jessica marveled at how much her life had changed in less than 2 years. She had gone from desperate and alone to cherished and complete, all because she had been brave enough to sit beside a silent cowboy and stubborn enough not to give up on him. The years flowed past like water, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their son. Thomas learned to crawl and then to walk, stumbling around the ranch on unsteady legs while Jacob followed a few steps behind to catch him when he fell. He learned to talk, his first word hoarse much to everyone's delight, and he chattered constantly in a way that seemed like cosmic balance for his father's continued silence. Jessica sometimes wondered if Jacob would ever speak again, if whatever had locked his voice away was permanent, or if the right moment might someday unlock it. She had stopped hoping for it in any desperate way, had learned to love and understand him exactly as he was, but she would not have been human if she did not occasionally imagine what his voice might sound like. Thomas turned 2, then 3, growing from a baby into a small boy with his father's quiet strength and his mother's warm heart. He followed Jacob everywhere, learning to handle horses and rope cattle with a natural talent that made all the ranch hands shake their heads in amazement. He was fearless and curious, and full of an energy that left Jessica exhausted by the end of each day. On a summer evening just after Thomas's 4th birthday, the family was sitting outside together watching the sunset. Thomas was playing with a wooden horse Jacob had carved for him, making galloping sounds and narrating an elaborate story about cowboys and adventures. Jessica sat on the porch steps with Jacob beside her, his arm around her shoulders, content to simply exist in this moment of domestic peace. "Daddy," Thomas said suddenly, looking up from his game, "how come you never talk?" It was a question he had asked before in various forms, but this time there was something more serious in his young face, a genuine desire to understand rather than simple childish curiosity. Jacob stiffened slightly beside Jessica, and she felt him take a deep breath. She waited, expecting him to ruffle Thomas's hair and distract him the way he usually did, but instead Jacob set down the coffee cup he had been holding and turned to face his son directly. Thomas walked over and climbed up onto Jacob's lap, his small hands patting his father's face. "I love you, Daddy," he said with the simple directness of childhood, "even if you do not talk." And something in Jacob's expression cracked, some final wall that had been holding back the tide for 4 years. Jessica saw it happen, saw the moment when grief and guilt and self-imposed punishment finally gave way to the present, to this beautiful life he had built from the ashes of tragedy. Jacob opened his mouth, and after 4 years of silence he spoke. His voice was rough and uncertain, rusty from disuse, but the words were clear. "I love you too, son." The world seemed to stop. Thomas's eyes went wide, and Jessica felt her heart stutter in her chest. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. Then Thomas threw his arms around Jacob's neck with a whoop of joy. "You talked, Daddy. You talked." Jessica was crying, tears streaming down her face as she watched her husband hold their son and bury his face in the small boy's hair. Jacob was shaking, his shoulders heaving, and she realized he was crying too, silent tears that spoke of years of pain finally released. She moved to them, wrapping her arms around both of them, and they sat there in a tangle of limbs and tears and overwhelming emotion, as the sun set behind the mountains and painted the sky in shades of gold. When Thomas finally pulled back to look at his father's face, he was grinning from ear to ear. "Say something else, Daddy," Jacob laughed, the sound cracking and uncertain but real. He looked at Jessica over Thomas's head, and the love and gratitude in his eyes was overwhelming. Then he turned back to his son and said, "How about I tell you a story?" "Yes." Thomas bounced with excitement. "Tell me about the horses." So Jacob told him a story, his voice growing stronger with each word, about wild horses running free across the Nevada plains and the cowboys who loved them. Thomas listened with rapt attention, and Jessica sat beside them with her hand in Jacob's free hand, crying quiet, happy tears. That night, after Thomas was finally asleep and they were alone in their room, Jacob pulled Jessica into his arms and held her for a long time. When he finally spoke again, his voice was still rough but steady. "I thought I had lost my voice forever," he said quietly. "I thought the grief had taken something from me that I could never get back, but you found me anyway. You loved me even when I could not speak, even when I had nothing to offer but silence and broken pieces." "You were never broken," Jessica said fiercely. "You were hurt, but you were never broken, and you had so much to offer, Jacob. You showed me every day through your actions and your kindness, and the way you loved me without needing words." Jacob cupped her face in his hands, his dark eyes intense in the lamplight. "When I tracked William Crow into those mountains, I was not planning to come back. I was going to kill him and then keep riding until the wilderness swallowed me whole. I did kill him, shot him while he slept because I could not trust myself to face him while he was awake. And afterward, I stood over his body and I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no closure, just an emptiness so complete that I wanted to disappear into it." Jessica stayed quiet, letting him talk, knowing this story needed to be told. "I rode for 3 weeks after that," Jacob continued. "No direction, no purpose, just moving through the landscape like a ghost. I did not eat much, did not sleep except when I fell off my horse from exhaustion. I wanted to die, but I did not have the courage to do it deliberately, so I waited for the wilderness to do it for me." "What changed?" Jessica asked softly. "I found a mare giving birth," Jacob said. "She was young, too young really, and she was struggling. I watched her labor for hours, and I kept thinking I should ride away, should leave her to whatever fate had in store, but I could not do it. Something in me would not let that animal suffer alone, so I helped her. I stayed with her through the whole night, and when the foal was finally born and she was cleaning it, looking at her baby with such fierce love, I realized something." He paused, his thumb stroking Jessica's cheek. "I realized that life continues. That pain and death and loss are part of the story, but they are not the whole story. That mare had probably never had an easy life, probably faced danger and hardship every day of her existence, but she still chose to bring new life into the world. She still loved her foal with everything she had. And I thought about Thomas Jr., about how much he loved living, how he would be so angry if he knew I was throwing my life away over his death. "So you came back," Jessica said. "I came back," Jacob agreed, "but I could not talk. Every time I tried to speak, I saw William Crow's face, heard the sound of the gunshot, remembered the emptiness I felt standing over his body. The words just would not come. I thought maybe they never would again. And then you arrived." He smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed his entire face. "You sat beside me on that fence rail and you just stayed. You did not demand anything from me, did not try to fix me. You just offered your presence and your patience. And slowly, day by day, you gave me reasons to want to speak again. You gave me a future worth having." "We gave each other a future," Jessica corrected gently. "I was lost when I came here, Jacob. I had no home, no family, no idea what I was going to do with my life. You gave me all of that. You gave me purpose and love, and the most beautiful son in the world." They kissed then, slow and deep and full of the accumulated emotion of years. And when they finally fell asleep in each other's arms, it was with the peace of people who had fought their way through darkness and emerged into light. Word spread quickly around the ranch that Jacob was speaking again. The next morning at breakfast, when he greeted the assembled ranch hands with a simple "good morning," there was a moment of stunned silence followed by a roar of approval. Men rushed to shake his hand and clap him on the shoulder, and Samuel had tears in his eyes when he pulled Jacob into a rough embrace. "It is good to hear your voice again, brother," Samuel said gruffly. "We missed it." Thomas Patterson was overjoyed, asking Jacob 100 questions about the ranch and the horses, and telling him stories about things that had happened over the past 4 years, as if Jacob had not been there for all of them. It was a celebration, pure and simple, and Jessica watched it all with a full heart. Life continued, richer now for Jacob's returned voice. He talked to the horses as he worked with them, his gentle words soothing even the most skittish animals. He talked to Thomas, answering the endless stream of questions and telling stories at bedtime. And he talked to Jessica, making up for lost time with long conversations that stretched late into the night, sharing his thoughts and feelings and dreams for the future. They had more children, a daughter they named Margaret after Thomas Patterson's late wife, born 2 years after Jacob started speaking again. She had Jessica's red gold hair and Jacob's dark eyes, and she was as sweet-tempered as Thomas was energetic. 3 years later came another son, Samuel Daniel, named after the foreman who had become Jacob's closest friend. Samuel was quiet like his father but had a mischievous streak that got him into constant trouble. The ranch prospered under Thomas Patterson's management, and Jacob's increasingly important role in operations. When Thomas decided to semi-retire in his late 60s, he made Jacob his partner and eventual heir, knowing the ranch could not be in better hands. Jessica continued to thrive, becoming a pillar of the small community in Carson City. She helped start a school for the ranch children and the scattered families in the area, taught Sunday school at the church, and was known for never turning away anyone who needed a meal or a place to stay. Jacob and Jessica grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. They weathered the challenges that life brought, the droughts and harsh winters, the economic downturns and the inevitable losses that came with age. Samuel the foreman passed away in his sleep at age 64, and Jacob spoke at his funeral, his voice strong and clear as he talked about friendship and loyalty, and the family that people create by choice rather than blood. Thomas Patterson died 5 years later, leaving the ranch officially in Jacob and Jessica's hands. They mourned him deeply, grateful for the chance and the support he had given them, and they named their fourth and final child Thomas in his honor, a son born when Jessica was 40 and Jacob 43, a late blessing they had not expected but welcomed with joy. Their children grew and had children of their own, filling the ranch with the sound of young voices and the energy of new generations. Young Thomas became a respected horse trainer, carrying on his father's talent and passion. Margaret married a doctor in Carson City and divided her time between the town and the ranch, bringing her own children out regularly to visit. Samuel Daniel eventually took over the day-to-day management of the ranch, working side by side with his aging father and learning everything Jacob had to teach. Baby Thomas, as he was always called despite growing into a strapping young man, became a lawyer and moved to San Francisco, though he came home as often as his practice allowed. Jessica and Jacob's love story became something of a legend in Carson City, the tale of the silent cowboy and the woman who sat beside him and refused to give up. People pointed them out when they came to town, holding hands after decades of marriage, their heads bent together in conversation or comfortable silence. On their 50th wedding anniversary, the whole town turned out for a celebration at the ranch. There was food and music and dancing, and Jessica wore a dress the color of the sky while Jacob wore his best suit and looked at her with the same intensity he had shown on their wedding day. Late in the evening, when the party was winding down and the younger generation was chasing children and cleaning up, Jessica and Jacob slipped away to their old favorite spot, the fence rail, where she had first sat beside him all those years ago. They climbed up carefully, their movements slower now but still practiced, and sat together watching the sun set behind the mountains they had looked at thousands of times before. "You remember the first time I sat here with you?" Jessica asked, her hand in his. Jacob smiled, his face lined with age but his eyes still bright and clear. "I remember thinking you were the bravest or the craziest woman I had ever met, maybe both." "I was desperate," Jessica said with a laugh. "I needed a friend and you looked like you needed one too." "I needed more than a friend," Jacob said quietly. "I needed someone to remind me how to live. You did that, Jessica. You saved my life in every way that matters." "You saved mine too," she replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We saved each other." They sat there as the stars began to appear, one by one in the darkening sky, and Jessica thought about the journey they had taken together. From that first evening with coffee cups and careful silence to this moment of complete understanding and enduring love, they had built something remarkable from tragedy and chance. "I love you," Jacob said, the words as meaningful now as they had been the first time he spoke them after 4 years of silence. "I will love you forever, until the stars fall from the sky and the mountains crumble to dust." Jessica turned to kiss him, slow and sweet, tasting 50 years of memories in that simple gesture. "And I love you," she said. "Thank you for asking me not to go all those years ago. Thank you for giving me a reason to stay." They remained on the fence rail until full dark, surrounded by the ranch they had built together and the family they had created, living proof that sometimes the most profound love stories are the ones that start with silence and patience, and two people brave enough to sit beside each other in the dark until the light returns. Their legacy would continue through their children and grandchildren, through the ranch that bore their care and commitment, through the community they had served, and the lives they had touched. But more than any of that, their legacy lived in the simple truth that love, real love, finds a way past any barrier, any pain, any silence, when two hearts are willing to remain open to the possibility of connection. And every evening, long after Jessica and Jacob were gone, their descendants would look at that fence rail and remember the story of the cowboy who had not spoken in 2 years, until a brave woman sat beside him, and he whispered, "Do not go," beginning a love story that would be told for generations as a testament to the healing power of patience, presence, and a love that transcended words.